The gold of the 21st century? Why cryptocurrency does not mean overcoming the trust-based banking system, and why proponents and opponents alike overemphasize the sphere of circulation. I'm not a friend of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies because they are not money and their value is extremely unstable and based on nothing but hot air. These were the words of Donald Trump in a tweet from 2019, and he followed up in the same vein in 2021. Bitcoin is a scam that also threatens the dominance of the dollar. With his crypto-skeptical stance, Trump was for once completely in line with German European opinion, because here, where algorithms originating in America are seen as dangers that need to be stopped by regulation anyway, Bitcoin and company are viewed with great suspicion. However, Trump has since done an about-turn. In May 2024, he declared that he wanted to put an end to Joe Biden's cross-stuff against crypto to ensure that the future of Bitcoin is made in the USA. In July, Trump appeared at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville, and after taking office in January 2025, he followed up actions with words and issued a crypto-friendly executive order. The rise of Bitcoin is a consequence of the global financial crisis. On September 15, 2008, one of its key moments occurred. At around 1 o'clock in the morning New York time, the major investment bank Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. Exactly 1.5 months later, on October 31st, an author calling himself Satoshi Nakamoto posted a working paper online entitled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. In it, Nakamoto outlined how a digital currency would work, allowing users to send money to each other in a reliable way without having to rely on institutions such as banks. Shortly afterwards, Nakamoto also published the software required to implement his idea, and the Bitcoin network went live on January 3, 2009. Bitcoin is based on a chain of blocks, and in the very first one, called the Genesis block, Nakamoto encoded a headline from the London Times of the same day. Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. In his working paper, Nakamoto names the creation of an electronic payment system without trust as his goal. Trust is replaced by cryptographic verification, which ensures that Bitcoins can only be moved by their rightful owners. Given the shakeup of trust in traditional financial systems, it is not surprising that this idea met with approval in the late 2000s. Initially, it was mainly cryptography experts and other internet visionaries who were enthusiastic about the new technology, mining Bitcoin on their home computers. The first use of Bitcoin to purchase a physical product was the purchase of 2 pizzas in Florida on May 22, 2010, but since then Bitcoin has experienced a steep rise. The 10,000 Bitcoins used to buy the pizzas are now worth around 900 million euros. Since its invention, Bitcoin has regularly been predicted to go under soon, but despite occasional crises and price slumps, it has, together with other cryptocurrencies, become an established player in the financial world. However, it continues to polarize opinion, and it is striking how far the ideology and reality of Bitcoin diverge. Convinced Bitcoin supporters take seriously the claim of inventor Nakamoto to create an alternative currency that is superior to the dollar because it does without banks, which are blamed for the crises of capitalism. In practice, however, cryptocurrencies still play a subordinate role in payment transactions. Bitcoin's great success is largely based on its function as an asset and means of speculation, which is why banks typically use the term crypto asset instead of cryptocurrency. You don't need to know or share Nakamoto's convictions to make money with crypto speculation. The main thing is that the number goes up. High-profile scandals, such as the bankruptcy of crypto exchange FTX and the conviction of its founder Sam Bankman-Fried in March 2024, say little in themselves about the ideology behind Bitcoin. Bitcoin adepts emphasize that conventional currencies, such as the dollar, are fiat money, pure paper money with no backing, such as gold. This is indeed a novelty in the history of money. In capital, Marx still took it for granted that a physical money commodity existed into which banknotes could be exchanged. Strictly speaking, the latter are therefore not money, but merely function as monetary tokens. MEW 23, 142. In times of crisis in the 19th century, It did happen that banks printed more money than the gold reserves could provide, and as a result, the exchange was stopped. However, such measures were temporary and ended with the return to the gold standard. The major crises of the 20th century then put an end to the traditional precious metal peg. During the First World War, the warring parties diligently printed money to cover the cost of armaments, and the attempt to return to the former gold standard after the war, combined with the falling profitability of key economic sectors and the crisis-preventing loans that were now more difficult to realize, led to recession and economic devastation. In the final phase of the Second World War, representatives of the Allied nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in July 1944 to reorganize the post-war financial order. The resulting Bretton Woods system amounted to an indirect gold peg. The dollar became the reserve currency into which all other currencies could be exchanged at a fixed rate, and only the dollar itself was still directly backed by gold. However, the system proved to be unstable. As other countries were accumulating dollar reserves, the U.S. Federal Reserve was forced to increase the amount of dollars without being able to significantly increase the amount of gold at the same time. Over time, the gold backing of the dollar became a pure fiction, and in August 1971, the United States officially declared the exchangeability of the dollar for gold obsolete. The Bretton Woods system was history. Was the abandonment of the precious metal peg a step forward? Even a liberation? Yes, if you believe John Maynard Keynes, who had already described the gold standard as a barbarous relic that blocked rational economic policy in his 1923 treatise on monetary reform. No, if you follow the monetarists of the Austrian school such as Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and Murray Rothbard. For them, it is clear that economic crises are caused by price-distorting modifications to the money supply. Ideally, it should therefore be impossible for the state to create new money at will. Supporters of this theory therefore see the era of fiat money as a historical aberration. Instead of soft currencies, whose money supply can be modified by institutions, they call for a return to hard currencies backed by a scarce commodity. In addition to its decentralized nature, Bitcoin is characterized in particular by its scarcity. New Bitcoins are currently still being generated through digital mining. Just over 19.9 million are already in circulation. The Bitcoin protocol has set an upper limit of 21 million. At the same time, the effort required for mining increases over time, so it is assumed that the last Bitcoin will not be generated until 2140. Crypto monetarists therefore praise Bitcoin as the gold of the 21st century, which is easier to manage than real gold thanks to its digital form. The economist Safidin Amis, whose book The Bitcoin Standard has been translated into 38 languages, is an influential mastermind of the monetarist Bitcoin wing. In Amis' worldview, history is determined by the contrast between hard and soft money, and he even goes so far as to develop a monetarist theory of culture. Hard money financed Bach's Brandenburg concerts, while soft money is responsible for Miley Cyrus' hip shaking. End quote. He calls Keynesians frauds who make propaganda for inflation. The vulgar libertarian idea that true capitalism can do without the state and banks, which merely undermine its stability as extrinsic disruptive factors, is widespread in the Bitcoin scene. On social media, crypto adepts often express themselves far more harshly than Amis does, and the radical hostility towards banks displayed there lends itself to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The U.S. Federal Reserve in particular has regularly been declared the root cause of evils, such as the Great Depression, since it was founded in 1913 under Woodrow Wilson's presidency. The anti-Semite and Holocaust denier Eustace Mullins claimed in his 1952 book The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, for example, that Jewish bankers had founded the central bank to profit from the economic devastation caused by war and depression. The extreme theories of particularly fanatical Bitcoin supporters do not deserve much attention. However, the arguments of sober-minded friends of hard currencies, such as the German literary critic and Bitcoin fan Ijoma Mangold, are well worth considering. Mangold relies on statistics on economic development since the end of Bretton Woods. While real wages rose linearly from 1947 to 1971, they have more or less stagnated since 1971. while productivity and wage growth rose in parallel until 1971. The former have been outpacing the latter since then. While income inequality has decreased in the USA since 1929, it has increased again since 1971. While the famous Campbell's tomato soup has known almost no price increase for decades since 1895, its price has shot up almost every year since 1971. End quote. According to Mangold's thesis, the softening of the currency due to the abandonment of the gold standard has, partly, caused this negative trend. A return to a hard currency is therefore desirable. Mangold, caught up in one-dimensional scientific thinking, explains an isolated individual phenomenon as responsible for the phenomenon of the decoupling of wages and productive power, which, like the abandonment of the gold standard, arose from the contradictory social totality that led to the crisis of the post-war Fordist model. After several decades of seemingly unlimited growth and prosperity, capitalism began to falter in the early 1970s. According to Marx, crises originate in the sphere of production. They can be mitigated in the sphere of circulation, for example by modifying money, but not completely resolved, MEW 42, 58-59. And indeed, an adequate analysis of the end of Bretton Woods cannot do without the sphere of production. In 1944, the USA was still the clearly dominant industrial nation, but by the mid-1960s, Europe and Japan had caught up. The fixed exchange rate made American products disproportionately expensive on the world market and thus weakened the American export economy. Flexible exchange rates made it possible to counteract this problem by devaluing the dollar. The developments mentioned by Mangold are also closely linked to the development of productive forces. At the end of the 1960s, the growth rate began to stagnate and productivity fell sharply worldwide. The neoliberal policies of the 1980s under Reagan and Thatcher were an attempt to counteract this development by lowering wage costs. However, the productivity levels of the immediate post-war decades, which made the relative prosperity of this period possible, have not been achieved again to this day. There is nothing to suggest that a reform of the means of payment could magically restore the economic conditions of the golden years of Fordism. The overemphasis on the sphere of circulation typical of Bitcoin supporters can also be found among its opponents. They dream of a democratic currency by means of which the economy could finally be rationally controlled. They believe that tying the currency to a scarce commodity, be it gold or Bitcoin, is, like Keynes, an elitist, barbaric relic of the archaic origins of money. Keynesian Mark Skyritz summed up this world view succinctly in Die Zeit back in 2012. It was only by turning away from gold that the states of the West placed the heart of capitalism, the monetary system, under democratic control. The criticism of paper money, similar to the criticism of political parties, expresses a contempt for the democratic mode of dispute and conflict, which is to be replaced by a higher order. If modern societies are characterized by the fact that they have to constantly produce their certainties anew from within themselves, then gold points the way back to a pre-modern world of timeless claims to validity. End quote. There is certainly no shortage of dispute and conflict within the leading central banks that shape monetary policy. In 1987, an employee of the Federal Reserve compared the bank to the Catholic Church. There's a pope, that is, the chairman, and a college of cardinals, that is, the governors and bank presidents. Then there is the curia, which consists of the high-ranking managers. The commercial banks correspond to the laity. We even have religious orders with different religious beliefs, like the Jesuits, Franciscans, and Dominicans, except that we call them pragmatists, monetarists, and neo-Keynesians. End quote. However, this monetary policy pluralism in no way led to a rationally controlled, crisis-free development of the American economy. On the contrary, the positions are abruptly opposed, and, depending on the economic situation, one or the other prevails, just as Marx's thesis of the priority of production would suggest. Even if the central banks had the creative power Skyritz ascribes to them, the utopia of democratic money is questionable. First of all, talk of democratically controlled central banks is misleading. because their real constitution releases them from any responsibility towards any influence legitimized by elections. On the other hand, one might argue that the centralization of monetary power at least brings with it the possibility of democratization, while pre-modern gold, like postmodern Bitcoin, cannot in principle be moved by democratic decisions. With this in mind, Josko Woolweber proposes in his book Central Bank Capitalism to tackle climate change through democratization and the creation of a new global currency called Ecor. But the danger behind the idea that unlimited control is welcome because it offers unique opportunities for democratization is obvious. Total power tends to elude effective control. What the heterodox economist praises as democratization turns out to be a technocratic nightmare that seeks to use central banks to impose a climate policy on states that is aimed at renunciation and would not find a majority in democratic elections. In April 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102, which prohibited private citizens of the United States from owning significant amounts of gold. Owners of gold holdings had to deliver them to their bank and were compensated with dollars. Today's Keynesians might welcome this as a contribution to democratization directed against elitist gold owners. For Horkheimer, however, who takes up this episode in his critique of Instrumental Reason, the looming end of the gold standard symbolizes the liquidation of the bourgeois individual. The deterioration of his situation can perhaps best be measured by the complete insecurity of his personal wealth. Under liberalism, the purchasing power of money seemed to be guaranteed by the gold standard. Security of wealth, symbolized by confidence in gold, was a moment of bourgeois existence, of the citizen as successor to the aristocrat. The abolition of the gold standard and permanent inflation are the symbol of a complete change. Even members of the middle class must come to terms with uncertainty. There are no safe zones on the highways of society. Everyone has to keep moving. End quote. In early 2022, Canadian truck drivers who took part in protests against a recently introduced mandatory coronavirus vaccination program did not want to keep moving. Money was collected on various donation platforms to support the campaign, but the Canadian government did its utmost to stifle the protest. Under the Emergencies Act, the government declared a state of emergency in February 2022, allowing it to freeze the bank accounts of 76 people involved in the protests and make the 3.2 million Canadian dollars held there inaccessible. The central thesis of the book Resistance Money, written by three Bitcoin-friendly philosophers, that Bitcoin can play a useful role as resistance money immune to institutional repression thanks to its decentralized nature, can hardly be dismissed in light of such incidents. In his article, Skyertz recommends that central banks sink their gold reserves into the sea. The European Central Bank has not yet followed this recommendation. However, they would love to let Bitcoin disappear into digital oblivion. In a working paper entitled The Distributional Consequences of Bitcoin, ECB economists Ulrich Binseil and Jürgen Schaaf launched a general attack in the fall of 2024. Bitcoin has devastating social consequences. It threatens social cohesion, leads to poverty, and would ultimately undermine stability and democracy. Binseil and Schaaf begin by noting that ideological debates about Bitcoin have little to do with its actual use. Contrary to Nakamoto's hopes, Bitcoins are hardly ever used for transactions. If you want to buy something with your Bitcoins, you first have to exchange them for a conventional currency. However, the Bitcoin dollar exchange rate is characterized by extreme fluctuations, which makes the scarcity of Bitcoin, which is so praised by crypto-monetarists and should ensure stable prices, practically irrelevant. Some Bitcoin enthusiasts continue to dream of a hyper-Bitcoinization, in which Bitcoin supplants other currencies. In reality, however, Bitcoin primarily serves as a risky but potentially lucrative investment. Many economists consider the Bitcoin hype to be a speculative bubble, as the high price of Bitcoin is not based on any real value methods, such as fundamental or technical analysis, are used to determine the value of financial instruments. In the case of shares, for example, the former analyzes company data on revenue and forecast growth, while the latter determines the value based on past price trends, and is therefore more like reading mathematical coffee grounds. Ben Sile and Schaff argue that rising Bitcoin prices are not accompanied by an increase in the economy's production potential due to the lack of a real value basis, unlike rising Apple shares, which give hope for better smartphones. On the one hand, there is therefore a risk that the bubble could burst and a rapid fall in the price could cause economic devastation. But even an ever-increasing Bitcoin price would have negative effects due to the lack of influence on the real economy. In the long term, this would only lead to a redistribution of existing wealth, with early entrants benefiting at the expense of latecomers. This means that escalating social distribution struggles are inevitable. Are we looking at a qualitatively new phase in the development of capitalism? There is much to suggest that the unproductive Bitcoin is merely the latest manifestation of the migration of capital from the production sphere to the financial sphere, which began in the 1970s and is the result of the continuing weakness in productivity. What seems particularly absurd about the current crypto hype, namely the expectation that the price will continue to rise indefinitely, is not so new. One of the reasons the 2008 financial crisis came as such a surprise was that rating agencies had classified investment products that consisted of nothing but high-risk real estate loans to buyers who were barely able to pay as practically risk-free. It then emerged that this assessment was based on the assumption that real estate prices would continue to rise. The problematic financial instruments were indeed based on a real value in the form of real estate, but rising prices ultimately led to the destruction of wealth. The core problem with conventional currencies, according to Nakamoto in his Bitcoin announcement in February 2009, is that you have to trust central banks not to debase the currency and store deposited money instead of lending it out with low cover. In 2025, some Bitcoin supporters continue to claim that Bitcoin is a scientific truth that leads us out of an ideology. The conventional currency system only works because people believe in it, without scientific proof, while Bitcoin is more mathematical, scientific, physical than subject to a belief structure. But this is a classic fallacy. Just because Bitcoin technology is based on proven correct mathematical processes, it does not follow that Bitcoin can assume its role as a currency or asset without confidence. Just the opposite is the case, as the ECB paper and a look at the immaculate conception of Bitcoin show. Satoshi Nakamoto is in all likelihood a pseudonym. At least to this day, no one knows for sure who the mysterious creator of Bitcoin really is. In December 2010, Nakamoto stopped participating in discussions in the Bitcoin Talk forum he had founded, and in an email from April 2011, he wrote that he had moved on to other things. Since then, there has been radio silence. In the early days, Nakamoto was actively involved in mining Bitcoins, but never spent them. It is estimated that Nakamoto owned up to 1,100,000 Bitcoins, which at today's exchange rate would make him one of the richest people in the world, at least in theory. Attempting to exchange such a large amount of Bitcoins for dollars would in all likelihood lead to a massive loss in value. Bitcoin owners must therefore hope that Nakamoto never touches his Bitcoins. In the relevant communities, people like to claim that there is no danger as Nakamoto has presumably destroyed the digital keys to access his Bitcoins. However, as nobody knows his true identity, the wish is obviously the father of the thought. Trust as the basis of the currency has therefore by no means been overcome, but merely privatized. While issues of trust only arise with traditional currencies when a crisis seriously calls into question the solvency of the banks, Bitcoin requires permanent PR measures thanks to its fluctuating price. During so-called crypto winters, when the exchange rate falls sharply, a whole army of crypto activists encourage the community to hold on to their Bitcoins with slogans such as HODL, created from typo and hold, and we're all going to make it. The particularly fanatical Bitcoin fans resemble a religious sect that dismisses any criticism as FUD, the sowing of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and ascribes to Bitcoin the magical ability to eliminate both crises and class differences. Behind this ideological expectation of salvation lies the private hope of an economically secure life. This can only be achieved with Bitcoin if new supporters and investors can be persuaded to invest their money in the cryptocurrency through noble goals or economic promises. The fact that every cryptocurrency has to rely on the internet, a technically complex and politically preconditioned system, remaining stable and available worldwide, is usually not even considered worth mentioning by crypto adepts. The Bankman-Fried case demonstrates just how much the internet has become part of first nature for them. When asked what Bankman-Fried would miss most in prison, his biographer Michael Lewis answers without hesitation: the internet. The subculture that emerged around Bitcoin and the crypto industry, in which crypto fans spent millions of dollars on ugly monkey images traded as non-fungible tokens, exemplifies the decline of use value in postmodern capitalism. However, the flashiest phase of the crypto hype is now over, and a pragmatic approach to Bitcoin and the like has prevailed. Established banks are offering crypto investment products to a broad customer base, a development that may also explain Trump's turn into a crypto fan. With the crypto industry showing no signs of disappearing, Trump wants it to be based in the US because if we don't embrace crypto and Bitcoin, China will. At least in the near future, a surprising crash in the price of Bitcoin also seems unlikely. If the Federal Reserve continues on its recent course of interest rate cuts, this will make riskier forms of investment more attractive. Trump's concern that Bitcoin could compete with the dollar on the global market has also proved unfounded so far. 88% of international transactions are still carried out in dollars. The hegemony of the dollar has long been a thorn in the side of the BRICS countries in particular, which is why the development of a digital BRICS currency has been under discussion since 2024. However, with his executive order strengthening American leadership in digital financial technology from January 2025, Trump may actually have found a way to use cryptocurrencies to strengthen the dollar in line with MAGA. This primarily promotes so-called stablecoins, which, unlike Bitcoin, can be exchanged for conventional currencies at a fixed exchange rate. Stablecoins are responsible for 2/3 of global crypto transactions, and the reference currency for 98% is the dollar. On the other hand, the executive order explicitly prohibits the development of a digital dollar, i.e., a cryptocurrency controlled by the U.S. Federal Reserve itself. Trump considers central bank digital currencies to be a threat to freedom, while decentralized Bitcoin stands for self-determination and independence from the government. It cannot be denied that central bank digital currencies can easily be used for comprehensive control of the population. With the development of the digital yuan, China is a pioneer in this field. It remains to be seen whether Trump's decentralized approach is actually the best way to push back Chinese influence, or whether the renunciation of the digital dollar makes the digital yuan an attractive alternative, especially for the BRICS countries, and thus promotes de-dollarization. In any case, the age of bourgeois individuals described by Horkheimer, who were able to remain calm despite fluctuating exchange rates, will not return. Can there be a better business in this world? You claim to be a computer genius and to have understood that the currencies issued by the world states are unstable, at risk of inflation, and generally threatened with extinction because they are far too inflexible with their national limitations on the one hand and too centralized on the other. As a result, a currency will be created that is available to everyone and can be used globally at any time. Because something like this already exists in the form of Bitcoin, whose wild fluctuations do not exactly make it a currency, they claim to have created a cryptocurrency that has a fixed exchange rate to the US dollar. The algorithm for this new cryptocurrency was certainly written quickly, and an astonishing number of people began exchanging their hard-earned national currency for the electronic promise. The model quickly picked up speed, as is not unusual for a Ponzi scheme, as long as no participant realizes that it is a Ponzi scheme. Terra had to be the name of the hard currency below that it was not. In order to be kept stable against the US dollar, Terra needed its own cryptocurrency called Luna. This was because the operators of Terra had no intention of putting the money they received from investors into US dollar-denominated securities in order to secure Terra's parity with the US dollar. Instead, and this was the really ingenious trick, they set up the following system. Anyone who wanted to get the Terra currency with a 1:1 fix to the US dollar first had to buy the Luna currency, whose value was based on supply and demand. At its highest point, in the second quarter of 2022, A unit of the artificial currency Luna was traded at over $100. This meant that you could buy a unit of Luna for 100 US dollars and exchange it for a unit of Terra, which in turn would be backed by exactly 1 US dollar. Which is to say that the creators of their electronic nothing called Luna were at times getting incredible returns in real currency, while at the same time claiming that no one was gaining or losing anything because the value of Terra was guaranteed. One wonders how stupid a person must be not to see through this business model, or rather, how greedy for money on the one hand and angry about the zero or low interest rate policy of Western central banks on the other, that they would get involved in such gross nonsense. Usury is nothing compared to this. It is simply sheer fraud, which the world's politicians watch in amazement as if it were a force of nature between the earth and the moon that humans have nothing to oppose. Although the Korean founder of Terra and Luna, Do Kwon, is now considered by many to be the most hated man in Korea, he is by no means behind bars. In order to postpone the imminent crash of Terra and Luna and keep the ripoff game going a little longer, Terraform Labs, Kwon's company, finally offered potential currency buyers an interest rate of 20% on any investment in Luna, apparently without any entrepreneurial concept as to where the 20% interest was supposed to come from in a real world in which people are already happy to receive 2% interest. Any investor would have known by then at the latest that things could not be right here. The authorities should have intervened by then at the latest. 20% interest with a low inflation rate is clearly usury, but a general 20% interest rate promised by an institution that consists of nothing but a few algorithms is announced embezzlement, because it is only possible to stabilize the old Ponzi scheme with new Ponzi schemes. It came as it had to. Luna crashed hard to earth. It went from over 80 US dollars to almost zero within a few days. At the same time, Terra fell below parity with the dollar and the snowball had landed. Anyone who guarantees a fixed exchange rate for a real currency must be able to procure the hard currency in enormous quantities in a very short space of time if the financial markets become turbulent and, for whatever reason, people want to exchange the artificial currency they had previously acquired back into US dollars. And this is precisely what cannot work in such a Ponzi scheme, because the fraudsters do not, of course, keep the money they have collected in any escrow accounts or safes in order to be honestly liable for the obligations they have entered into, just in case, but because they squander it themselves and put it to one side. But politicians do not intervene. How could they? Which politician could explain to the public how our monetary system works from their own understanding, let alone contribute to clarifying the absurd fantasies of the crypto community? The central banks are also failing. Christine Lagarde says that her own son is involved in crypto, but fails to explain to the audience why she could not even make her son understand what nonsense he is up to. To put it bluntly, as long as an institution like the German Bundesbank, which no longer has any monetary policy responsibility at all, stores tons of gold in its cellars in order to somehow create the impression that it is backing the paper money system, any attempt at enlightenment can actually be dispensed with from the outset. As long as the majority of academic economists follow monetarist patterns in their lectures and derive the significance of the money supply for inflation on the basis of the so-called quantity equation, which only provides any indication of the money supply if assumptions are made, which are never supported by reality, it is no wonder that rich cranks and computer freaks can persuade the masses that the modern monetary system is on the verge of collapse and that the only way to protect your money is to entrust it to the swarm intelligence of many cryptocurrencies. Due to actual shortages in certain areas that are central to the real economy, e.g. raw materials for energy and food, consumer prices have risen sharply and there is a threat of persistent inflation at an undesirable level due to a lack of cooperation between the parties and central banks. The fact that cryptocurrencies, which were launched precisely with the promise of protecting against the loss of value of established currencies, are plummeting in value at precisely this time because the whole world wants to get rid of them as quickly as possible thanks to rising interest rates and a weakening global economy, is a comedy of the ages. The crash of Luna and Terra has shaken up the entire crypto casino, causing Bitcoin to halve in value compared to November 2021. What is simply outrageous not to say indecent, is the way these events are being commented on by so-called experts in the financial sector. One emphasizes that there is still no sound databases for a long-term view of Bitcoin, as if empirical evidence were needed to expose a clearly unproductive system based solely on speculation for what it is. A rip-off game in which big players and scammers line their pockets at the expense of either gambling addicts, naive, money-hungry, often young people or frustrated workers who are paid inadequately for the work they do. Another expert mocks investors by saying, "Many people are hurting right now and are having a rude awakening. The crypto market is like a roller coaster ride. You have to buckle up and enjoy the ride." And the icing on the cake is provided by the somewhat more daring crypto experts who, in view of the drop in value, advise that now is the time to make a new entry, which means nothing other than heralding a new round of roulette and courting many fools to get involved in this madness. After all, the report quoted here comes from the website of the public broadcaster Tajesh. Its author does not shirk from writing in the subheading of his article. The slump in the price of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies has destroyed hundreds of billions of dollars. Destroyed. And how, pray tell, did these hundreds of billions of dollars come about? By blowing up a balloon called cryptocurrencies with hot air. The public media should actually contribute to debunking dangerous fairy tales through sensible reporting and thus render them harmless from the outset. But this would require people to use their common sense and have the courage not to play along with the emperor's new clothes game. But how could this be achieved in a world in which a well-known and respected private university in Frankfurt advertises a certified blockchain expert certificate course on its website with the following text? Blockchain is considered the brilliant technology of our time. It was founded in 2008 when Satoshi Nakamoto published the white paper on Bitcoin. Since then, numerous cryptocurrencies have been created. Hundreds of startups and companies around the world have launched corresponding projects, and programmers are working on future applications every day in the ecosystem of Ethereum, the second largest cryptocurrency. All of this, the sums invested, the committed companies, the supporters, indicates that technologies are emerging here that will change the financial system in particular. The crypto world has long been far too big to disappear again. End quote. Yes, exactly. These technologies are changing our financial system because the fairy tales that are transported with them are not exposed as such. There is no table for everyone in the real world, only one in the financial world for a few cunning people. And they have now, not only thanks to the stupidity of the masses, but also thanks to the stupidity and cowardice of economists, developed a power that will not disappear anytime soon. This is ensured by the education provided at such brilliant universities as the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. The world's major central banks, which like the ECB, have secretly buried monetarism instead of doing so transparently, publicly, and emphatically, have failed enormously. The attack that this would have represented on the neoclassical neoliberal doctrine of economics was probably too unpleasant and unwelcome in wide circles. Apparently, the central bankers responsible did not realize how deeply rooted in human prejudices is the idea that a stable money supply is needed to prevent the devaluation of money, or at least to keep it within narrow limits. The phrase "too much money chasing too few goods," used again and again by monetarists, seems so immediate that hardly any economist has tried to expose it for what it is, namely the representation of a relationship between two quantities that can never be used for what it is supposed to do: fight inflation or even predict it. Despite this obvious proposition, we never know in advance what too much money means. Whether the existing money was too much money can only be said in retrospect, when inflation has already occurred. Then we know that the central banks have financed a process that was inflationary. Then you can indeed say that this process only came about because the central banks financed it. However, this does not mean exactly what the vast majority of economists claim. This is because central bank financing was only the necessary condition for inflation, which came about for completely different reasons. Only if central bank financing were the sufficient condition for the emergence of an inflationary process would it be possible to deduce from the fact that a certain money supply has increased that inflation will occur. Since this is not the case, The theorem of the too large money supply and the too small quantity of goods has no meaning. Nevertheless, it is an excellent way of causing confusion, and that is exactly what the majority of economists are doing with it. The crisis-induced increase in government deficits and the zero interest rate policy have done the rest, so that large sections of the population are skeptical about the monetary system and their own national currency and are looking for alternatives. The fact that Japan has been pursuing a zero interest rate policy for 30 years, and even now, in an environment of high price increases on some world markets, still has very low inflation rates, is simply not taken note of. However, it would be crucial for central banks and top politicians to explain these correlations in order to prevent further uncertainty among the masses. But how does ECB President Christine Lagarde criticize cryptocurrencies? My very sober assessment is that cryptocurrencies are worth nothing, that they're based on nothing, that there is no underlying asset that acts as an anchor of security. End quote. And that is different with the euro. The average citizen is supposed to conclude because it is backed by a large, stabilizing asset. And under this safety anchor, the average citizen imagines the gold holdings in the Bundesbank's vaults. This kind of enlightenment fuels people's uncertainty about our monetary system instead of putting the brakes on it. When the ECB chief then adds, the day we launch the central bank's digital currency, a digital euro, I will guarantee that the central bank is behind it. And I think it is very different from many of these things. The reassurance strategy is likely to miss its target completely. Ms. Lagarde should have said that behind the euro, whether in coin, paper, or digital form, is completely irrelevant. There's a large association of economies with a large stock of physical capital, whose citizens largely agree that they want to use this capital stock to produce goods and services every day based on a division of labor. And it should have said that the stability of the belief in the value of the currency is essentially determined by whether productive work is reasonably valued with this currency, or whether the currency can be misused by some people to enrich themselves without productive work.